everyone, and welcome to this session on COVID supply chains in the era of COVID-19. I'm delighted to chair this session and introduce four very talented speakers from across the university who are going to talk about different aspects of the chain. I think one of the things, just by way of introduction, I think we've seen significant disruption to supply chains really from 2016, which is the time of the UK referendum about its membership of the European Union. And I think really from that time, and possibly even longer, you start seeing companies start to prepare and change their sourcing of products, processing, thinking about where to move. But the closer we got to the UK's actual exit, what we see is a very different level of preparedness across the chain. Some companies very prepared for this significant change in the way that they trade, they source and they transport their goods and get them to the consumer, and others not prepared at all. And we have the UK-EU trade agreement now governing the relationship between the two countries, but that's still complicated, as we know. Boris Johnson trying to seek renegotiation of the Northern Irish component of that agreement at the current time. So overlaid on top of that, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, which our speakers will talk a little bit more about in a moment. And I think early on, she and I sort of did some thinking around this really early on in the pandemic, seeing just where the chokeholds along the supply chain were actually coming with the pandemic. So from labor through to storage, warehousing, obviously shortage of workers and illness along the chain. So some really interesting complexities early on in the pandemic in 2019. But I think now what we're seeing is a much more complex picture emerging of the interaction between some of the trade issues that the UK is going through and the COVID-19 pandemic. And even things like shortage of CO2, which is crucial for the supply chain, is in the news today. So against this highly complex background, we have four speakers today. Dr. Roxana Babilescu from the School of Public Policy, Faculty of Social Science, whose research focuses on migrant communities, and I'll let her say a little bit more about that in a minute. Followed by Professor Graham Dutfield from the School of Law. He's Professor of International Governance in the school and a specialist in intellectual property law, so patents, copyrights, and other associated intellectual property rights. Claire James, who we heard from a little bit earlier, is going to be looking at another aspect of her research. And finally, Professor Chi Wong from the Business School, who is Professor of Supply Chain Operations and Management and the Director for the Centre of Operations and Supply Chain Management. He focuses on supply chain integration. So I'm really delighted that our speakers could join us this morning. And so what we're going to have is these four presentations, and then I'll open it to discussion. So please feel free to comment on the chat as we go through, post your questions in the chat, and we can use those as a basis of discussion as we go through. So I'm going to start by handing the floor over to Roxana to give her presentation. Thank you, Roxana.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to this really interesting and very timely session. And I really look forward to hear also your insights and questions and to have the debate at the end of this presentation. Now we have very little time, so I will start introducing a little bit the project and telling how it connects with some other things that I'm doing and my colleagues and I are doing. And then I will start with introducing the project and talking about the side of migration and migrant workers in agriculture. And then I will give the floor to my colleague Bethany, who will talk us through the findings on the farmer side. So we'll be very quick. So just to introduce the project, this is a ESRC UCRI funded project under the Rapid Scheme COVID response. The project is feeding the nation's seasonal migrant workers and food security during COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm working with on the project with my colleague Bethany Robertson and with Professor Carlos Silva, who is at the University of Oxford. We have a Twitter and a website with coming elements, as you will see, and a monthly policy bulletin and a few other resources. So just to briefly start and introduce the topic. So we often talk about food systems without thinking in the people that man the entire system, and we start seeing now, as you've seen these past few weeks, there has not been one day in which we didn't have news about the effect, the impact and the effects of labor shortages within the food systems. And I wanted to mention that I've just recently started with colleagues in the N8 Agri-Food Network, a project for the Food Standards Agency, looking precisely at that, at the impact of labor shortages on food availability, food safety, and we're working on doing a report for them for this year. That will come out this year. So to start off, it's a really important issue because migrants tend to be located in agriculture, and they are the main labor provider, the main workers across the developed nations. And this is true from Norway to the US. We also know that this has been growing and the dependency is there since the early 60s. In the UK, it was the same. The UK introduced a seasonal worker program starting from at the end of the World War, so from 1945, and has since recruited from abroad for operators that are then certified by the Gang Master and Labor Authority in order to bring in workers. They are brought in every year in June, May, June, and return in autumn at the end of harvest. Now it's been really interesting because Brexit and COVID have had a big impact on the recruitment, retentions of these workers. And what has happened is first a disagreement. We didn't know how many workers there are. The whole industry has started to look at the numbers from 2016. So we only had numbers, estimates of the need for workers from the industry, from the British Growers Association and National Farmers Union, that put it up to 75,000 workers needed every year. Then there were other estimates of the government that provided later around 60,000. But this changes as production changes and supply changes and imports change. However, this was only triggered from 2016. If you look at the June survey in agriculture, we have exquisite data, I would say, about any other aspect of agriculture, including stock and land use, but we don't have as much who are the people that work and produce the food that we need. Where do they come from? How stable are they? What are the ages of the workers in food systems and agriculture? So this has started to change from 2016. What has happened is in 2019, the government started to introduce a pilot for seasonal workers, first of 2,500 workers only, bringing them mainly from former USSR republics, predominantly Ukraine, then 10,000, and last year 30,000. So this year we have a maximum of 30,000 visa put forward for seasonal workers. Is the only sectoral visa in the UK. All the others are individual, not for a sector of the economy, which is very interesting for me. And what is really important is that it doesn't cover, it was only meant to cover half of their demand. The other half was to be supplied through a local recruitment, either of migrants with USS or settled status, or from local British workers. There was a scheme, Pick for Britain, that wasn't as successful, and that has been scrapped for this year. And the USS population has been massively impacted by Brexit, and many are leaving. And of those who are in the country, only 48% don't have settled status, so only have a temporary status for 5 years. So they will also, from those who are already in the country, some of them will lose this status because it's only temporary, will not require accrue enough evidence and rights to secure their right to stay in the UK past these 5 years. So there is another very large impact coming that we are moving towards. And now I will give the word to Bethany if we have a few more minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Roxana. Yes, I'll just talk briefly looking at from the farmer perspective. So we're also looking at the solutions that farmers are having to implement in order to fill any labour shortages that have been brought about by COVID and Brexit. And it's interesting in the sense that COVID was a precursor that represented farmers having to change their long established practices around recruitment and retention of their staff, and thinking about solutions to fill that gap. So for example, from our interviews, farmers have often talked about changing their crops in order to, for example, grow crops that can easily be harvested via technology rather than manual labour as one solution. Secondly, growing a range of different crops that are harvested at different periods of time during the year, which would enable seasonal workers to have a longer time on the farm, which might increase the attractiveness to British or local workers as well. But also thinking about the Pick for Britain campaign, bearing in mind one of DEFRA's solutions to the shortages are to increase the British labour force, thinking about what were the issues for farmers and the massive time investments when they were receiving hundreds of applications in order to undertake agricultural work, but actually ending up with 2 of those starting in the fields because of the mismatch between expectations of what the work entails, the physical manual labour, but also wider issues around the rural localities and how that may not fit within the expectations of British workers. And I think it's interesting going back to the start of today when we were introduced to the kind of tagline of the GFEI around healthy people, and we tend to think of that on the consumer side, but actually in this project we're trying to link that up to the production and thinking about the kind of working conditions and the resilience of farm businesses, looking at both the growers themselves and what solutions they can implement, but also of the migrant workers and how that relationship plays out. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Bethany, and thanks to Roxana too. It's a fascinating project. Looking forward to seeing more results from that. I'd like to pass over now to Graham. So Graham Duffield. Oh, I think you're having issues with the mute button, Graham.
Yes, sorry. No matter how many times I do this, I always do that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'd like to thank Fiona for asking me to be part of this. I suspect I have the least expertise in the room actually on this particular issue because most of my work is sort of international. So I do intellectual property in health and food technologies and Of course, one IP right that Fiona didn't mention is geographical indications, which is quite an important one. I worked a bit on that, so I'll come back to that. I also work on sort of heritage, culture, and nature in the law, broadly construed. So I've been involved in projects in Peru. One is the Potato Park, and I was sort of helping to advise on sort of branding their products. Of course, they are, you know, those communities in Peru, they make finished products, so they're not part of a whole chain, and they're selling in local markets. That's a relatively straightforward issue. This is something that's a lot more complicated. So I've got interested in this sort of idea of short supply chains, and for environmental, economic, and social advantages. And I think there is a lot of interest now, and it's kind of ironic that this interest coincides with Brexit and with COVID. But in a sense, I mean, I've done no research in this, so I'm sort of just like a consumer, you know, a consumer, but somewhat informed because of the research that I've been doing. So forgive me, this sounds like a bunch of random thoughts sort of loosely assembled in the next 5 minutes, but that's you know, so it might sound a bit sort of 101 to most of you. I'm just exploring this, you know. Of course, with Brexit and COVID, for those who want to defend Brexit, it's a COVID problem, and for those who want to highlight the problem of Brexit, it's a Brexit problem. It seems to me it's sort of both, and sometimes it's a bit hard to separate the two out. So yeah, so just on Brexit, it's been an object lesson in a sort of radical transformation of the country, led by people, if I might be controversial, well, we were academics, so I guess we should be, led by people who largely don't understand very much about trade law and trade regulation. I think it's probably fair to actually say that their learning curve is very steep, but actually it's actually hasn't. It needs to be steep. I'm not sure if it has been very steep at all. As for COVID, of course, we're realizing, as the previous speaker said, that for some goods, localness does require, has been requiring non-local labor. And it's a kind of irony that the government is struggling to get their heads around and not doing a particularly good job. You know, the irony. So in terms of what I've been writing recently, I did with my co-author Uma Thurston, and we did an article on food fraud. And I don't know whether that's at all relevant, but of course, with long, complex supply chains, food fraud is always going to be likely to happen. And so we looked at the possibilities of geographic indications as a way to certify goods as being local, and to the extent that GIs do have that effect in practice, then that would be quite a good thing. Although current experience shows the system can be gamed, especially with popular goods. So I was asked by a reporter once to write about the fact that with Parma ham, the pigs weren't. Some of the ham was coming from Spanish pigs. Rather than local ones, and that's going to happen. The system can be quite easily gamed, unfortunately. So the more popular goods are, the more that's likely to happen. But otherwise, I'm just another guy who's thinking, where do we get our food from this week? So I think I'll just leave it there, thanks. But I'm happy to take part in discussions afterwards. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Graham. So Claire, over to you.
So I've already spoken this morning, and my research is around the right to food. And I just want to look in this 5 minutes at really the effect of the issues around the supply chain, and also the sort of slower than ideal government response. I think the government did respond to some extent, but possibly not as quickly as they should, and not as effectively as they should. And we'll all remember the fact that, well, it's happening again, but supermarket shelves are empty, I suspect, for a lot of us for the first time in our lifetimes. People were being told to shield because of health conditions. These are already some of the most vulnerable in our society. They then couldn't get food because they couldn't access supermarket delivery slots. There were issues with incomes, and obviously more and more people were having reductions in their income because of the effect of the pandemic. And obviously for those people who may have been, close to food insecurity in the first place, they don't have an extra packet of pasta at the back of the cupboard to rely on. And this was compounded because food banks were in a situation where they were unable to get the staple foods that they rely on to feed their clients because they weren't available, and people weren't putting an extra packet of pasta in their trolley and putting it into the food bank bin. Food insecurity rose, and we, for the first time, as I say, we probably had issues with both access because people couldn't get to the supermarket, get a delivery slot, and, as I've said, availability. We ended up with this ad hoc situation for a lot of vulnerable people, or people who were shielding, where they relied on their neighbours, their family, or even charities to make deliveries to them. We also had a lot of publicity, I think, for the first time in the news about the idea of the right to food. I think Marcus Rashford, publicised the issues around free school meals, both during holidays normally, but specifically because of COVID. I think, the public conscience was finally pricked by the idea of people, children not having enough food. And so we are having campaigns now. Scotland is working towards it, but in the UK, a lot of cities are now declaring themselves as right to food cities, and the idea that this has actually got some legal standing now. As I said earlier this morning, we already are a signatory to the International Covenant on Social and Cultural Rights. This is obviously not enshrined into UK law in any way in terms of us being able to enforce these rights, and unfortunately I doubt it is going to be anytime soon, because the new Justice Secretary has previously said he doesn't believe in rights like the right to food. Of more interest, possibly, is the European Convention on Human Rights, which is not something you would normally associate with the right to food. It tends to deal with civil and political rights, but it is part of UK law through the Human Rights Act. And actually, it has started to consider food in some of its cases. There's quite an old case of Stanev, which was primarily about an individual who was kept in a psychiatric facility in Bulgaria. There were lots of problems in terms of why he was there and the general standard of his living, but they did bring up the issue of food. And more recently, there has been a case from Hungary where the complainant was in a transit zone, and because of complications of immigration law, could leave the transit zone, but it would mean leaving his family and not being able to come back. And because of this, the state decided they had no obligation to provide him with any food, and he was living out of dustbins or what people could have given him, and food supply in this area was pretty ad hoc anyway. There was a heavy reliance on NGOs, but there was no sort of guaranteed contract. So the European Court is now starting to suggest that degrading treatment, which is absolutely prohibited in international human rights law, can be engaged by improper food supply. And so this sort of brings you around to what happened in the UK. And as I say, the government did act, they did relax some competition laws, they did make some temporary concessions on free school meals, and they did increase universal credit payments. They are now going to potentially, I think, reduce these universal credit payments. And you may have seen that Oliver De Schutter has already been very critical of that, and that, it's a regressive step that generally is prohibited in human rights law unless it is associated with a thorough evaluation of the effects, and, really clear sort of explanation of why it's necessary. And obviously we just haven't had that. So in terms of, where to go from here, obviously I would love to see the right to food enshrined in UK law. I suspect we're way off there, but I think we can still look to the right to food to give us some guidance. Supply chains have given us cheap food. Depending on which breakout sessions you're in this morning, you might have seen that this is not such a good thing. And we also have this policy that you may have heard Tim Lang coin as leaving it to Tesco et al. And in good times, that seems to have worked from a point of view of people having food, possibly not the most ideal food. But I think we need to have a food minister. We need to have steps, somebody who can jump in immediately and ensure that, things are done to limit the effects of any kind of threats in the supply chain. It needs to be an immediate response. We also have this issue, that's been highlighted again about COVID, about access to healthy, nutritional, balanced diets. And I think we're in a situation, where a lot of people just cannot afford to do that. We need to have a guaranteed basic income for full. We need to price out a healthy plate and make sure everybody can afford that. I agree that we need much better provision for food for children in schools, either, depending on the circumstances. This might be breakfast programs, but I think we need more extensive free school meal provision. And we need to work with supermarkets and supply chains to reduce the cost of fresh food and healthier options and make sure we've got access to those, and we reduce the ultra processed food. So, as I say, I think we do ideally would enshrine the right to food in UK law, but I think, more importantly, we need to have a cohesive government policy that is led by a specific minister who can oversee all these things and ensure that, in the face of Brexit and, another supply chain crisis, we can work more quickly to deal with the shocks and, reduce the amount of food insecurity that results.
Thank you, Claire. It's a fascinating idea of this Minister for Food, and interestingly, the president of the Food and Drink Federation, Ian Wright, suggested exactly the same thing at one of the committee sessions in the House of Commons. So it's amazing how aligned you're already, you are with the thinking about how business interacts as well with government. So fantastic. Thanks very much. So Chi, over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. Me and my team have studied the impacts of COVID-19 on different companies, food and non-food in supply chains. We have interviewed different companies and also conducted some surveys. So based on some of our understanding, I will just explain to you some of our findings. I'll divide my sort of information into two groups. One is high income country, where we are UK, Europe, and US. But also I want to tell you a bit more about what we found from low-income countries, because they are actually the suppliers of food to us. In the high-income countries, we see actually, even though there are some impacts on food shortages, most of us still survive. We eat, we get food, and so on. So the impact is not as serious as the low-income country. What we see is the supply chain in a more advanced country would have to adjust, because in the past we have two separate supply chains for food. One focusing on only restaurants, catering, hotels. They have a very specific supply chains, and they do not normally supply to supermarkets. All right, but then we suddenly stopped all the restaurants, schools, and hotels. Suddenly, these supply chains have no customers, and on the other side, supermarkets has increased customers. So there were a lot of adjustment being made to enable supermarkets to get the food supply, and then of course increase some the cost involved. And the increase in cost, what Claire mentioned about food insecurity, is also a big problem now, because high-income country rely on low-income country to supply them with different food and products. The problem with COVID is that you slow down the demand, you decrease the demand for a period of time, you end up having a supply chain which is very unbalanced. Then we realized, when everybody started to open up the economy and release, make the lockdown measures easier, what happened is that all the slowdown in demand has decreased the capacity. So we end up having not enough containers sending goods from the East to Europe. And the container price gone up from $1,000 to $3,000 at one point. So you see some shortage in food, because simply people do not want to import those low price food with a $3,000 containers. So there were some shortages because of that. And in fact, the same problem happened to our CO2 shortage. CO2 shortage is because the demand for gas has gone down, and therefore the supply has gone down. And then when everybody started to wake up and have more economic activities, you increase the demand significantly, and therefore shortage drives the price up. That's the cycles that we see in every crisis. And so price has gone up. and hopefully it can go down to something more normal. Therefore, I support what Claire said. We have to have some sort of ministry to understand and to control this non-market phenomenon, because market is not going to care about whether you have food to eat or not. It's the minister who makes sure that we have enough fuel or enough food supply or food storage and so on. So then I'd like to move on to the low-income country. We see a lot of shutdowns in factories, and there you have lots of migrant workers. But migrant workers, I mean people who come from villages, go to industrial towns to work, and they're all being sent home. So many of them actually have no income and no income support, no furlough scheme or nothing. So they actually suffer from lack of income to access to food themselves. And some of these are working in the food factory, not fashion factories and so on. And so they also affect the recovery, because then the factories will have to call them back and incentivize them to come back to the factories. That is not safe, because low-income countries have no vaccinations or lack of vaccination programs and so on. So that is actually affecting quite a lot of food insecurity issues in especially low-income countries. Now we are very lucky in the UK. We can afford to import or pay more for food, but there are actually quite a lot of challenges when it comes to low-income country. The other thing we realize is that the government lockdown measures actually can significantly affect the supply chain. In some countries, you have no COVID case policy. That means the government actually lock you in your house and not allow you to go out, and you can't even order food. It's the government who take over the food supply chain. And that is a very different scenario. We don't see this here in the country. But that actually has created a switch in the ways of food is supplied. The government took over, and government sort of assigned businesses to send food to your home apartments when you're being asked to self-isolate or lock down. And that happened 15, 20 days or more in some countries. That becomes very serious. As opposed to the other country that has no actually such policy or no financial resources to have that kind of strict control, what they have to go through is actually, let's get everybody infected. And that actually happened in India, where food insecurity happened because you simply actually get a lot of infections. People were very panicked, and the queues in front of the food stores were very long, and so on. You have that kind of issues as well in the supply chain. So that's some of the findings we have, and I hope we can recover better. But from a UK perspective, yes, food security, I believe we need to put a bit more emphasis on and understand, especially we import so many foods from outside, how we can actually secure this at a more government level. Thank you.
Thank you, Chi. I think we've heard some really interesting perspectives and a lot of cross-cutting themes as well from all our speakers. I've got loads of questions, so many interesting things, but I want to turn it over to the floor for questions for our panel. If you want to raise your hand, if you want to put it in the chat, please do. I'll try and keep up with the chat as well. Anybody want to start us off? Just looking for hands. Aha, Louise, yeah, great.
Hi, it was a bit of a comment and a question, I suppose, but you talked about the idea of having a minister for food, and I think that's really great. I think one of the things, there was a bit of information, was that in the current Transforming Food Production call, there are a number of people who are putting together a bid for a What Works Centre for food. So although we have a What Works Centre for other things, I don't know if people hear me because my screen's gone all funny.
Yeah,
Yeah, we can hear you, Louise. We're just frozen in time there.
Oh, that's okay. But I just wanted to let people know that there is a plan to develop a What Works Centre for Food. And we know that AHDB are developing some kind of What Works Centre for agriculture, not necessarily What Works Centre, but and also FSA are thinking about diet in the thinking. I would endorse that, you know, it's really important that we have a minister for food, but they need to have some clout as well.
Yeah, and definitely endorsement for that idea as well, Claire, in the chat, and Anne's put in maybe exploring it within the context of the new MSc as well. So yeah, definitely great ideas on that. Any other points people want to raise? Okay, so I have a question, I think probably for you, Chi, but please others come in on this. So I was attending a conference last week, and my Ian Wright, who I've mentioned before, who's the president of the Food and Drink Federation, made the point that he believed that the just-in-time food delivery system that we've enjoyed in the UK, where food just arrives, if you like, as the supermarkets or consumers of food or at the night before, that is now dead. And we know, so I'd really appreciate your views on that.
Thank you, good questions. I think it's not dead. It will never die. So remember Claire said, you know, you have to make sure that the price of food is low enough for everybody. And so on. So we have so many low-income people who rely on cheaper food, go to Asda to buy food, things like that. Okay, you can never actually eliminate this efficient, so-called efficient just-in-time supply chain, because that is how that they can get the lowest price possible. So when we are back to quite a normal situation, a year or two later, that supply chain will come back. And then when we have another pandemic, yes, we will start to talk about, you know, the opposite of this just in time. Unfortunately, at the moment, we only have a system that gives you the lowest price, and that is just in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think Anne raises some interesting points in the chat as well about it's difficult to shift. We've got an embedded system. It's very difficult to shift, isn't it? So is it really dead? Louise, I can see your hand up again. Is that
no? It's everything's frozen for me. I can't mute myself. I can't put my hand down. I can just listen. So ignore me.
Michael, you've come onto my screen. Do you want to raise a point here?
Hello there. I was actually just thinking of another recent development, which is the sort of heavy concentration and consolidation in the food supply chain. And particularly with reference to the Yorkshire area, we've got two of the big four supermarkets with Asda and Morrison's have both gone, well, Asda's already undergone a significant change in ownership, and Morrison's may well likewise. And the result is that two of the key players, the government has looked to see us through the problems of COVID-19, will have very new owners. And I just wondered whether anyone definitely the case of Asda, possibly in the case of Morrison's. And I wondered about the impact on this. And again, the level of accountability.
Chi, have you got some thoughts on that? And then go over to Claire, I think.
Let me try. Morrison had financial difficulties even before COVID. So they were not competitive enough. And that's the reason why they were looking for a different owner. I think consolidation could happen when another supermarket, bought Morrison. But the challenge we have faced in the UK is that now we have less and less number of big supermarkets, and we have more and more concentration of power. Is that a good thing? Maybe yes, because they can gain economy of scale, but then they have more power to pressure the farmers. So it's hard to tell whether this is a good thing or not, or whether consolidation is the right way to solve our problem.
Thank you. And Claire, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There are obviously, there are economy of scales issues, and one of the things that has been said is we need affordable, healthy food. I think my concern is with bigger and bigger consolidation in supply chains is the power that these companies have in terms of influence of policy. Is policy necessarily going to be what's the best to tackle obesity, to tackle food insecurity, to encourage people? Is it going to be the best thing for profits? And I think, obviously, a bit like, the just-in-time supply chains, obviously we have a world where, large companies are going to be part of our food systems for the foreseeable future, if not ever. But I think we do need to find a balance between the positives that they can bring, but also, how much control and influence do they have of what we're eating and the policy decisions governments make. So, we don't end up in a situation where, because of that, we leave large sections of society food insecure or, suffering from, obesity or other diseases that are related to diet.
I think one of the fascinating things about this discussion about the concentration of supermarkets and the sort of just-in-time delivery, I think it takes us right back to Bethany and Roxana's research as well, doesn't it? About how the unexpected consequence on production of changing government policy, so allowing concentration of business, maybe not really thinking about the impact of their policies on supply chain. So just sort of coming back to Bethany and Roxana, one of the questions I'm quite interested to get your views on is, did you get any sense within your work that farmers were interested in government policy? Were they reacting to government policy in any way? What's your impressions on that?
I'll say a few words, and then Bethany, if you can as well.
Great, thank you.
So they are mostly very interested. It's really interesting who the government is listened to, because they are not always listened to as well. And as always, there is increasing equality between those whose voices are heard and those who are not. Larger producers do get more presence, and their voice is more heard, and small and medium farms, certainly there is a big issue in that. But there is interest. But I just wanted to say that perhaps with this crisis, the COVID crisis, we can learn more about food systems, because we used to think them as producers, supermarkets, consumers, and that's about it. And now we learn that there are workers in the systems, that they are the transport, the drivers are important, and wholesale sellers are important, and buyers. So we are really rediscovering this element in the system, and I think that this is really important to gain that temperature.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I know, Bethany, you're just about to come in, but we're counting down, and I think we've got loads of this conversation could go on and on. So please get involved in the Global Food and Environment Institute. Get in touch in relation to supply chain, and let's continue this conversation. Thanks to everybody, and particularly to our speakers for